Hello, my name is Nathan Cannon, and this presentation is going to be about the Syrian war and its legal implications, both for the United States and the international community. Before we talk about that, I want to give you a brief overview of Syria and how the war began. Syria has an authoritarian government. That's a form of government in which the population is expected to be obedient to one ruling class or one person. In Syria, that's the Alawite sect of Islam, and that one person or one family is the Assad family. Now, a brief history of the Assad family. The Assads came to power in Syria in 1970 through a coup. Hafez al-Assad was an Air Force general, and he ended up taking power through a coup, and he was elected president and then prime minister of the country in 1970 and 1971, and he ruled for 30 years. During that 30 years, there were many protests and uprisings, and he would always bring the military in and slaughter the population. If you disagreed with him, then they would kill you or they would put you in prison and torture you. His oldest son was supposed to be the next to succeed him, but he died in a car wreck in 1994, and so the next son in line to take over after that was the current leader of Syria, who's Bashar al-Assad. Bashar was trained as a medical doctor in Syria and then later moved to Britain and was trained as an ophthalmologist or an eye doctor. He's also a trained surgeon. But after his brother died, he was called back to Syria, and eventually after Hafez passed away in 2000, he was elected president of the country, and he won by 99% of the vote, which is just unheard of, right? The way the Syrian civil war came about was due to the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring was a revolutionary uprising of Arab countries and nations in the Middle East and in North Africa. It began in December 2010 and it ended in roughly 2 years later in December 2012. There were 8 countries involved in the Arab Spring. The first country where the Arab Spring originated in was Tunisia, and then after that, Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Bahrain, Syria, Morocco, and Jordan. In Tunisia, they overthrew the ruler. In Egypt, they overthrew al-Sisi. In Libya, they overthrew Gaddafi. In Yemen, they're still at war. And it's a proxy war between the Saudi Arabians and the Iranians. In Bahrain, they quashed the Arab Spring, and the royal family still rules. In Syria, they're still at civil war. Morocco, the royal family quashed the uprising, and same thing in Jordan. The royal family quashed that. The Syrian civil war is still ongoing. Again, it began in March 2011. It began with graffiti, anti-government graffiti, and the government cracked down on it. And within days and weeks, thousands were protesting in squares, and the government was just coming out with its military and slaughtering civilians. at first with just rifles, and then with tanks and other means. But it got ugly fast, and it's still going on. Some stats on the war to just put it into perspective. The war has been going on for 6 years. An estimated 400,000 Syrians have been killed. That doesn't include people from other countries, because there's a lot of other countrymen or people from other countries fighting in Syria. There's an estimated 5.2 million Syrians who have fled from Syria just to seek refugee status in other countries, and that's caused a huge displacement in the Mediterranean and in Europe. Almost weekly you'll hear of a report of a boat of refugees sinking or being caught by the Coast Guard. 6.3 million Syrians have been displaced inside Syria. They're just seeking or moving from one city to another, trying to avoid conflict. But prior to the start of the Syrian civil war, the country's population was 21 million. So over half the country has been displaced since the start of the war. And now to date, 6 years later, 8 other countries are involved in the Syrian civil war, and those are Russia, the US, Israel, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, which is UAE, Bahrain, Lebanon, and then there's a few terrorist organizations also involved in the war: Hamas, Hezbollah, and ISIS, as well as Al-Qaeda. So that's a brief overview of what's going on right now, or some background on the Syrian civil war. Some of the atrocities that have been committed during the war by both sides, by all sides I should say, over the course of the war, and all of these have been documented through the UN, and the UN has 10 or 15 different agencies on human rights, relief, then you have the Red Crescent, but it's been documented that the Syrian government has used chemical weapons on civilian populations, namely sarin nerve gas. The Syrian government has starved civilians to death as a means of warfare by using blockades to prevent food and medicine into cities. The government has also, not just the government, but other factions have tortured people and murdered civilians. ISIS is big in Syria, or they were until recently, and there's been tons of videos of ISIS executing people in orange jumpsuits by all sorts of heinous means, unethical means, immoral means. It's been documented that hospitals have been attacked, medical personnel have been attacked. It's been documented that Russia, who is Syria's biggest ally, has targeted hospitals for attack. And we know this because nobody else has advanced fighter jets like Russia. Also, the Syrian government's denied access to humanitarian relief, such as food, medicine, water, and essentials. All of those things previously mentioned are violations of international humanitarian law, human rights laws. They're violations of the UN Resolution Charter. They're violations of the UN Charter against using weapons of mass destructions. In this case, chemical weapons. There's also been crimes against humanity, rape, murder, starvation, a few of the other things previously mentioned. And then this war has also caused a humanitarian catastrophe by displacing half of an entire country. There's also another doctrine called responsibility to protect that the UN upholds, and just on that one doctrine, the UN could send in a peacekeeping force into Syria, if for nothing else, to protect civilians and make sure that they get food and water. Besides that, excuse me, the Hague, the 1907 Hague regulations dictate that, or the laws and customs of war on land. And then in 1948, the UN adopted a Universal Declaration of Human Rights to be upheld by United Nations member countries. So just based on those three things, the UN or any of its member states could interdict in Syria. In conclusion, the U.S. could have legally intervened sooner in Syria. We have, on a small scale, and we could have, because we're obligated to prevent such a catastrophe. We haven't seen a loss of life like this since the genocides in Africa in the 90s or Bosnia-Herzegovina, but human rights laws and international humanitarian laws are in place to prevent stuff like this, and we're sort of sitting on the sideline. It's famously known that President Obama set a red line that if Syria used chemical weapons on their people again, because it was documented they had 2 or 3 times previously, that the United States would interdict militarily. And they did use chemical weapons again, and the United States didn't do anything. So we kind of looked like we didn't have the gusto to back up our words. But I really feel like we could have prevented a huge loss of life if we would have went into Syria sooner. In conclusion, the Syrian war is a terrible catastrophe on humanity, and more needs to be done to save the Syrian people, in my opinion. Thank you.